You're listening to the Lawyer Lifestyle Podcast with Chicago attorney Dave Scriven-Young. This podcast is brought to you by Anchor, which is the app that I use to record and edit the Lawyer Lifestyle Podcast. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast, so let me explain. It's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so that it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more platforms. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. And it's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 226 of the Lawyer Lifestyle Podcast for June 12th, 2020. My name is Dave Scriven-Young, an attorney from Chicago, Illinois, and I'll be your host. This podcast takes you on a daily journey to discover key principles in the areas of marketing, sales, and leadership for attorneys. So today is the last episode for which we are going to talk about Dr. John C. Maxwell's Leadershift. We are going to switch from the leadership topic and talk about what I would consider to be marketing. And generally, we are going to be talking about how your personal brand can be used to bring in business and to gain influence. And we're going to be using as our textbook Gary Vaynerchuk's book, Crushing It, from 2018. And so it's going to be a really great time to get cracking on our social media chops and to continue to use social media, again, to increase our brand, increase our influence, and to increase the business that comes through those efforts. So look forward to having that discussion starting on tomorrow's podcast. But for today, we're finishing up our diversity section, and I hope that we've all gained some new perspectives on diversity and inclusion. And the last obstacle that we have concerning that prevents us from having a diverse team as opposed to a uniform team is failing to be inclusive. Now, it's interesting because, you go to a lot of places and a lot of organizations and a lot of companies, and they have what is considered diversity and inclusion officers. And what's fascinating is the difference that Dr. Maxwell sees in the perspectives of baby boomers and Gen Xers concerning inclusion as opposed to the way that millennials see diversity and inclusion. Whereas Gen Xers and those baby boomers talk about inclusion in terms of morality. It's the right thing to do because, all people of all walks of life, of all ethnicities, genders, sexual orientation, those with different gender identity, religion, all of those people, ethnicities, all of those people should have fair representation within an organization. It's just simply a right thing to do to give people representation. On the other hand, what Dr. Maxwell says is that millennials see diversity and inclusion as having its own intrinsic value because it's important to have all people have a voice within an organization because it's not just the right thing to do. It actually helps. It actually helps because when you bring all of these people together and everyone is seen as a contributor and everyone is empowered to present their perspective and have a voice, then your organization suffers dramatically. Also, where Gen Xers and baby boomers see inclusion in terms of gender, race, religion, ethnicity, and sexual orientation, millennials take it a step further they want to bring people of those differences together as well, but they're also interested in bringing together people with differences in background, personal experience, style, and perspective. And I've always, and for me, I'm kind of in the middle of all of that. I consider myself a Zennial, which means I'm somewhere between Generation X and Millennial. If you look kind of like on the age chart of the generations, and so like I'm in that group where yes, technology was just in terms of the computer was really just starting, personal computer that is, was really just starting into being. So things like email and the internet, personal computing, that really just started as I was growing up. So, as I started growing up, we only had a few cable channels, and by the time I was, 18, there were many more. When I started, when I was little, the personal computer was like the first, Macintosh, Apple Macintosh computers that were, those big boxy things with, the printers where you had to tear off the sides. Kids look that up. The dot matrix type printers. When I was getting into college, that's when real the laser inkjets came into being. It's when the internet started, and so I sort of see both. I'm sort of a caught in the middle type of the generation, but I always felt like diversity and inclusion was kind of off the mark because it was mostly about giving people representation, and while that was good, it didn't seem to really capture the reason to have diversity and inclusion. And that's why I think so many people nowadays look at it as just playing lip service to a certain group of people, whereas real diversity and real inclusion is about giving, not only just saying yes, I have a certain percentage of African Americans, a certain percentage of LGBTQ, a certain percentage of Hispanics, et cetera, et cetera. But it's about actually giving these people a voice at the table, and not. And yes, you celebrate the differences, but you also celebrate what everyone can contribute. That they all have a voice, and that each of those voices is valuable. And so, for everything that's coming into play now with anti-racism, where I think a lot of people were fine to step back and say, well, yes, well, look at our organization. We have a diversity director. Well, we don't see that as good enough. Maybe it was for the baby boomers and the Gen Xers, but for people my age and for millennials, that just is not simply good enough. And that's where this, again, the anti-racism comes into play. And so John Maxwell ends this chapter by giving us a few ways that we can shift to diversity and inclusion, but into that latter definition of inclusion, not just representation, but a real voice. And so we do that in 3 ways, which number 1 is to create a culture of sharing. Again, this is what I was talking about yesterday about giving people, or 2 days ago, about giving people a voice, and that if you don't allow people to have a voice, then they're just going to shut down. They're not going to be creative. They're not going to share their knowledge. And the only way that you can do that is by inviting people to speak up, by telling people that they're valuable, by giving them opportunities to lead even before they have an official role, maybe even before that you feel that they're actually ready to take on those leadership roles. So you want to share space, share responsibility, share ownership, share rewards, so that everyone wants to contribute. And that's true diversity, that's true inclusion. Number 2 is to broaden your perspective on diversity. And again, what I said earlier is true, whereas before diversity was mainly talking about diversity in gender, age, and race. and ethnicity. Perhaps now we're talking about more than that. Sexual orientation, gender identity, and also other things such as personality, values, and abilities. That's going to be the definition of diversity going forward, and we all want to get into that. Something I saw interesting. There was an interesting LinkedIn post that I saw from somebody in the attorney ethics field, and I don't know if you've ever seen that cartoon where you have it's a baseball field, and then sort of behind the bleachers, just outside of the field, you have, and it's typically African American kids who are of different heights, and they're sort of looking out they're trying to watch the game from outside of the park. And where, the cartoon is trying to make a difference between, or a illustration of, equality versus equity. Equality was that all of them could what was it, that each of them would have a box to stand on, but that because the kids were at different heights, maybe the tallest kid could see into the park and the other kids could not, although they were given the same box to stand on. The equity was to allow all of them to see into the park, so the boxes were made at different levels. Well, nowadays, and the point that this lady was making with her LinkedIn post, is that it's no longer enough to think about that and be fine with that, because why is the fence there? Why aren't the African American children allowed to be in the park and watching the game? And so we've gone now beyond equality. We've gone beyond equity. Now we're into an era, I believe, of true inclusion, and to think about how everyone should be allowed into the park to play a valuable role, and not to allow, yes, maybe you're giving different boxes to people to stand outside. We don't want them to stand outside. We want them to come in because they're actually valuable to us. Then valuable, if you think about the scenario, valuable to the team. What's the point of making them stand outside when you'd rather them having them be in the park and be part of the crowd and cheering? So that's number 2. And then number 3 is to provide solid leadership for diversity to be effective. And the only way, and again, what we talked about a few days ago with conflict that will result with a diverse team, well, you have to be a leader that allows for that conflict to occur, that allows for a diversity of opinions and a diversity of perspectives to come into play. And yes, there will be conflict. And yes, there will be difficulties making decisions when you have a more diverse team. But as Dr. Maxwell says, good leadership can help bring strength to both ideation and implementation. So if you're a good leader, or you want to be a good leader, then you're going to welcome the conflict that occurs, and you're going to help your team, your diverse team, make good decisions, to have good debates, and to be able to use those perspectives to come to a better decision. So I hope that you've learned a lot going through this book. Hope you've learned a lot about leadership. I know that I have. I've learned a lot in terms of how to treat people, how to go into meetings with people, how to mentor people. And as I'm a mentor, looking to what the mentor would like, and what they're looking for, how to be a leader of a team as opposed to just going on my own, how to challenge people instead of just trying to please people, how to become and to foster more creativity with an organization as opposed to just having and maintaining quality. And then finally, thinking about having that moral authority as opposed to just having authority based on what my position is. And then, of course, what we've talked about with diversity and things that have been going on, for the past 2 weeks now. It's so important and more important than ever that we realize that demanding real diversity, real inclusion in our organizations is something that everyone is going to want. And if you want your organization to go into the future and to be a place where people want to go, then you're going to have to be a leader within that diversity and inclusion state. So join me tomorrow for the first introduction to Crushing It by Gary Vaynerchuk. This is somebody that I followed a lot, and I'm very familiar with his story. He came to the United States as an immigrant from the former Soviet Union, and now he's essentially one of the biggest personal brands on the face of the earth. He's a speaker. He's an author. He is a business leader. He started in his father's liquor store, and he grew that business, even though he wasn't a partner and didn't gain anything from it. But using social media and other ways, he grew his father's liquor business and now has one of the is sort of the brightest stars in the advertising world. He has his own advertising agency. He's also has a sports agency, and he's just somebody to watch. And he is somebody that you definitely want to look to in terms of social media. So we're going to be going through his book and really doing some practical applications with it as we go along. So I invite you, as always, to join in the discussion. You can leave me a voicemail by going to anchor.fm/attorneydsy and hitting that message button. You can leave me a comment for me to play on the show or a question for me to answer on the show. You could also leave me a comment or a question on social media. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at AttorneyDSY, and I'm also on LinkedIn. So let me know if you have any comments about this episode. Tell me what you think about this podcast, or give me a topic you'd like to hear about. This podcast is on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, Pocket Cast, TuneIn, and Anchor, so please be sure to subscribe and rate and review. I also want to invite you to the next session of the Lawyers Emotional Intelligence Book Club, continuing on with Dr. Chad Ritchie's book, The Stress Solution. The next session will be Wednesday, June 17th at 7 p.m. Central. You can find out more at facebook.com/lawyerseq. Have a great day or night, and remember to fight for the lifestyle that you want and become the rainmaker that you need to be.